the Grouchy Nerd.
Alright, you antisocial weirdos, it's time to learn a game that can play at the ideal player count. 1. Arkham Horror, the card game, designed by Nate French and MJ Newman and published by Fantasy Flight Games, is a story-driven deck construction game, which pits you as a helpless and hapless investigator trying to survive against the terrors and machinations of the mythos of noted racist dickhead H.P. Lovecraft and his contemporaries. Luckily, the game focuses on Lovecraft's genre-defining horror writing and not his being a raging piece of his other stuff. Your goal in Arkham Horror is to survive, and usually save the world. The game is generally played in a campaign made up of several scenarios, and each scenario will give you different objectives that you must meet before time runs out and you either die or go insane. Or sometimes you'll go insane and then die, and then usually the world ends. But sometimes, all of existence ends. So, no pressure. It also shares a lot of DNA with Marvel Champions, also co-designed by Nate French, but where Marvel Champions feels more like a blockbuster popcorn movie, this feels something more like Chernobyl, a dark, gritty, limited series where you feel just a little bit worse at the end of each episode. But, in a good way. Arkham Horror can be played solo in two ways, either multi-handed, where you play multiple investigators as though controlled by multiple players, or true solo, where you take just one investigator. I myself prefer to play true solo because the other hand's usually busy holding the bourbon. However, gameplay is mostly about two things, finding clues and dealing with monsters, so if you're playing true solo, you have to be pretty good at both, but if you're playing multi-handed, you can be a bit more focused on having one fighter and one clue gatherer. There are 5 classes, and the core box and most investigator expansions come with one investigator for each class. Guardians are largely about dealing and taking damage, good for tanking, love guns and stuff, not always great at finding clues. Seekers are the opposite. Books and research help with gathering clues, but aren't so great at fending off foes. Mystics are the magic users. There's a risk-reward element to Mystics as they attempt to harness the power of the mythos for their own end. Pretty good at both fighting and clue gathering, but not the best at staying alive. Rogues like to gamble. They use resources to pull off huge plays, or fail spectacularly trying to pull off huge plays. They're also very good at keeping enemies busy while usually not having to take too much damage. And survivors, my personal favorite class, are just regular folk who get caught up in the madness, often finding ways to turn a failure into a success. There are also neutral cards which any investigator can take regardless of their class. Encounter cards, the bad guy cards, are broken up into encounter sets, indicated by the symbol here. In general, if a card ever contradicts the rules we're about to go over, the card is going to take precedence. Now, I'm going to try to be as light on spoilers as possible because there is nothing quite like your first trip through each campaign, but with all the different choices you can make and objectives you may or may not accomplish, this game is very, very replayable. And I have put that theory to the test. I play this game a lot. No matter how mean it gets, no matter how mad I get at it, no matter how much pain it causes me, I just keep coming back. I might be broken. You'll probably want to make a copy of the campaign log found at the back of the book or print one off from the Fantasy Flight Games website. The campaign log will help you keep track of story assets gained, objectives you accomplish, as well as mental or physical trauma you might endure throughout the campaign. Choose your investigator. The book recommends starting with Roland Banks. No, that's Joe Banks, and we're not doing this. Each investigator has their investigator card, a mini card, which you'll use to track their movements, a signature card, and a signature weakness. The back of each investigator card shows some deck building rules, including required deck size and which classes that investigator can take. For instance, Roland can take any Guardian card levels 0 through 5 and Seeker cards levels 0 through 2, as well as neutral cards levels 0 through 5. I'll explain card levels at the end of the video. But this means that as an FBI agent, Roland Banks can kick some monster butt, but he's also at least pretty decent at finding clues. Weaknesses and your signature cards don't count toward that deck size, by the way, and neither do cards with the permanent keyword. You're also going to get a little backstory, which is mostly just for a bit of flavor, but you can use it to help inform certain choices you make throughout the campaign. For instance, Roland Banks, the Fed, would be more likely to go to the authorities with his findings than, say, Skids O'Toole, the ex-con. On the front, we get the investigator's name, a title, their class, a trait or traits, their signature ability, and an elder sign ability. Throughout the game, you'll need to pass skill tests. The skills you'll be testing are represented here: willpower, intellect, combat, and agility. Anytime you have to perform a skill test, you'll test your skill versus a number given by the game and then draw a random token from the chaos bag. If it's a number, add, or more likely subtract, the number from your skill value. However, you may bolster that skill value by committing any number of cards from your hand with matching skill icons. here. But you must commit those cards before you draw the chaos token. An investigator at the same location as another investigator taking a skill test may commit one card from their hand to help out with that skill test. A card committed this way must have at least one matching icon for the skill being tested. A wild icon will count for any skill. Committed cards are discarded and revealed tokens are placed back in the bag. So if you draw a treachery like Grasping Hands, you'll have to test your agility against a 3. You're sitting at a 2 as Roland. If you commit a manual dexterity with its 2 agility icons, you'll be at a 4. Then you draw a token from the bag. A -1 brings you back down to 3, but that's all you needed to pass the test. Then because you passed the test, manual dexterity lets you draw a card. Important to note, if another investigator does help out by committing something like manual dexterity to a test, that investigator gets to draw that card, not the investigator that took the test. Some tokens have a symbol. The Skull, Tablet, Cultist, and Elder Thing tokens will be defined by the scenario reference card. Spoilers, they're not good. The Elder Sign effect is defined by your Investigator card and is usually quite good. Drawing this one, the one we try not to talk about, automatically fails that test, no matter what. And you'll fail at a 0. So back to that Grasping Hands example, if you committed the manual dexterity to bring your skill up to a 4, but then you pulled the auto-fail token, you're going to fail at a 0. And because Grasping Hands deals 1 damage for each point you fail by, you'll then take 3 damage. But no token can make you dip below a 0, so let's say you didn't commit that manual dexterity and you go in at your 2 against a 3, and you pull a -3 token, you're still only going to fail by 3 points, not by 4 points. And that goes the other way too. If you have a card that lowers the difficulty of a test, like Flashlight, you can never make that test be less than 0. This is the investigator's health and sanity, the amount of physical and mental torment that the investigator can take before they're defeated. If you're starting a campaign, all the cards you take should be level 0 to start out with. As you progress through the story, you'll earn experience, which you can spend on leveled up cards. Levels represented by these pips. The rulebook has a recommended starting deck for each investigator. Build Roland's deck as recommended. Investigator decks must include their signature cards, both good and bad, as well as a random basic weakness, which you can pick from the supply. See, the deck represents the investigator's complete character, all of their skills, talents, tools, allies, but it also has things that are hunting them, or haunting them, or injuries that they might have. When a weakness is drawn from your deck, you must immediately resolve its revelation ability. So, unlike basically every other card game ever, there's a certain amount of risk when you draw a card from your deck. Player cards have a name, a cost in resources, a class, skills that will be boosted if you commit this card to a skill test, traits, and the card's abilities. Assets might be talents or tools or allies and are paid for and put into play. Some cards are unique, as noted by this star. There can only be one copy of any unique card by name in play at a time. But that's it. The unique rule isn't nearly as complicated as it is in Marvel Champions. You just can't have 2 in play. You can even take 2 in your deck. You just can't have them both in play. Some assets will take up slots, as indicated in the bottom corner of the card. As default, you start with only 1 ally slot, 1 accessory slot, 1 body slot, 2 arcane slots, and 2 hand slots. 2-handed weapons will take up both hand slots. If you play a card that takes a slot, but that slot is already filled, you must first discard the card that's in play. This is also the only way you can remove a card from play that takes up a slot, which can actually be kind of a bad thing. If, for instance, you run out of bullets on Roland's 38 special, you can't put it in your discard pile in hopes that you will shuffle your deck and draw it again. It's stuck out until you can play something else that takes up that hand slot. Events provide one-time effects and then are discarded. Skill cards can only be played by committing them to skill tests. Gather the damage and horror tokens, which you'll use to track damage on your investigator, your allies, and enemies. Resources, which you'll spend to play cards, but also track uses on cards that have uses, like bullets in a gun or charges on a spell. And the 2-sided clue/doom tokens. If you're playing with more than one investigator, choose one to be the lead investigator. Now, playing solo, this mostly won't matter, as the lead investigator makes final choices during the campaign and breaks ties, but there are certain effects through some campaigns that will only affect the lead investigator. Decide what difficulty you want to play at. Easy, standard, hard, or expert. Now I'm going to be real honest with you here. When I'm playing true solo, which is probably 98% of all of the time that I've ever spent playing this game, I play it on easy. When I make other people play with me, sure, I'll go up to the blistering heat of standard. But by myself, no. It's easy all the way. And believe me, the word easy is doing a lot of work here. It's still a very difficult game. It's basically a dominatrix and you're in its dungeon. What? Depending on your chosen difficulty, place the listed chaos tokens in a bag if you have one, or a bowl or something if you don't, to create the chaos bag. Or bowl. Take 5 starting resources and draw 5 cards for your starting hand. If during this step you were to draw one of your weaknesses, set the weakness aside and draw a replacement card. Then you may perform 1 mulligan by setting aside up to 5 of these cards, drawing that many replacement cards, again replacing any weaknesses. Then shuffle any set aside cards back into your deck. The scenario you're playing will determine the rest of the setup. Be sure to read the intro to the scenario, which sets the stage for what you're about to do and may give you an idea of what you're trying to accomplish. Gather the indicated encounter card sets, but don't shuffle them together just yet, as many scenarios will instruct you to set certain cards out of play at the beginning of the scenario. For instance, in the very first scenario, you're instructed to put the study location into play in your play area and put each other location aside, along with the Lita Chantler ally and Ghoul Priest enemy, both part of the Gathering encounter set. When locations go into play, place them so that their unrevealed side is up. When you begin play, or when you move into a location for the first time, you'll flip to the revealed side. Set the agenda deck by stacking each agenda card sequentially with 1A on top, and do the same for the act deck, but be sure to note any special rules for those cards. For instance, some scenarios will have multiple versions of some act or agenda steps that go into play depending on choices you've made or objectives that you have or have not accomplished. The agenda is the game progressing against you, and the act is your progression against the game. Generally speaking, you want to advance the act deck and you want to avoid the agenda deck advancing, although you'll have very little control over that. Advancing the act deck often requires spending clues, as noted here. This symbol means per investigator, so if you're playing with more than one, you'll have to do some math. Set the scenario reference card nearby, making sure that you have the correct side up, either easy standard or hard expert if you hate yourself. The setup instructions for the scenario will tell you when to shuffle the remaining encounter cards to create the encounter deck. Encounter cards are enemies and treacheries. When enemies are drawn, unless otherwise indicated, they will spawn in the location of the investigator that drew it, and will immediately engage with an investigator at that location. Engaged enemies go into your threat area, which is just sort of in front of you. Enemies have a name, a fight value, hit points, and evade value, and do damage and or horror seen here. Treacheries will often involve a skill test for the investigator who drew it, though some may also go into your threat area. Still others might just make your life a little worse and then discard. Place your investigator's mini card on the study. When you're ready to start, flip the study to its revealed side. Anytime you reveal a location, this number will tell you how many clues to place on that location. Remember that this symbol means per investigator. So in the case of the study, you'll place 2 clue tokens for each investigator. Each turn plays thusly. Begin in the investigation phase. Each investigator performs 3 actions. If you're playing with multiple investigators, you may choose which goes first, and you may pick a different order of activation each round. But each investigator must finish their 3 actions before moving on to the next. Draw a card. That's it. It's not very flashy, it's not very efficient, but sometimes you just need another option, or maybe you're digging for a specific card to get into your hand. Gain a resource. This is the least efficient action you can take. You really only want to do this one if you have something that you absolutely need to pay for this turn. Play a card from your hand by first paying the cost seen in the top left corner. If it's an asset, it goes into play. If it's an event, perform the action indicated in the text and discard the card. Playing a card with the fast keyword can be played without using an action. Activate an arrow ability on a card. Arrow actions may be found on assets in play, the location you're on, weaknesses, treacheries, or even sometimes the act or agenda. Abilities with this sort of squiggle line don't cost an action, nor do reaction abilities, noted with this sort of swoopy arrow. Squiggle lines and swoopy arrows? That's what we're going with? Alright. A note here, if one investigator has a weakness or a treachery in their threat area that has one of these activation arrows, another investigator at that same location can trigger that activation. Move to a connecting location. The study has no connecting locations, but you'll eventually find yourself in a location that does. Locations have a symbol in the top left, and along the bottom it will list symbols of locations that location connects to. Keep an eye on that though, some connections only go one way. If you move to a location while an enemy is engaged with you, that enemy is going to come with you to that new location. It will also get to take an attack of opportunity, which we're going to go over here in a little bit. Remember that when you enter a location for the first time and flip to its revealed side, you may have to add clues. Some locations might also have an extra effect or cost when you enter or leave that location. To search for a clue at your location, you must test your intellect against that location's shroud value seen here. If you succeed and there are any clues on that location, take one and place it on your investigator card. If you fail, nothing happens. Fight Fight an engaged enemy at your location by testing your combat skill against this number. If you succeed, deal 1 damage to that enemy. If you're playing with multiple investigators, an investigator can attack an enemy that is engaged with a different investigator, but if that attack misses, meaning if you fail that skill test, the damage done is going to happen to the engaged investigator instead of the enemy. Or you can spend an action engaging that enemy first, pulling it into that investigator's threat area instead to safely attack it, or just to take it off of a squishier investigator. Sometimes fighting isn't the best option. You can attempt to evade an enemy by testing your agility against this number. An evaded enemy disengages from the investigator and exhausts. An exhausted enemy does not engage another investigator if they move into that location, nor will they attack during the enemy phase. If you have an enemy engaged with you, any action other than fight, evade, parlay, or resign will trigger an attack of opportunity, meaning that the enemy or enemies that are engaged with you will do damage before you resolve the action. So if you have a ghoul on you and you play your gun, it's going to get to take a swipe at you while you're fumbling with the holster or whatever. And as mentioned, if you move while you have an enemy engaged with you, not only will it get to take an attack of opportunity, but it's also just going to come along with you to the new location and probably attack you again in the enemy phase. Though playing cards with the fast keyword as well as the squiggle line or swoopy arrow will not trigger attacks of opportunity. They don't take an action, therefore there's no opportunity for the enemy to attack. Now sometimes you're going to be using those arrow actions in place of these sort of basic investigate and fight actions, often at a bonus. For instance, using your flashlight to investigate will lower the shroud of that location by 2. Or fighting with Roland's 38 special will give you not only a bonus to your combat value, but also deal bonus damage upon a successful hit. You may advance the act anytime you have met the requirements specified on the act. This often, but not always, involves spending clues. Clues spent to advance the act are returned to the supply. To advance the act deck, flip it over. Be sure to check for any new story. Then follow all instructions, which may involve things like putting into play cards that you previously set aside out of play. Then set that card out of play and check the new act card for any new rules or conditions that must be met to advance that card. When each investigator has taken their 3 actions, move on to the enemy phase. Enemies that are already in play that have the hunter keyword will move 1 space toward the nearest investigator. If it's equidistant from more than 1 investigator, you get to choose which one it will move toward, unless that hunter has a prey keyword, in which case that will break the tie. So if an enemy has the hunter keyword and its prey is the investigator with the most health remaining, it will still move toward the investigator that it's closest to, but if it's equidistant, then it will use the prey keyword to break that tie. And that prey is going to break any tie, so if an enemy with prey is spawned at a location with 2 investigators, normally you get to choose which investigator it's going to engage with, but if it has prey, you're going to go off of that instead. Then any ready or not exhausted enemies engaged with an investigator will attack that investigator, dealing physical and or horror damage as indicated by the hearts and brains here. Unless damage is specified as direct damage, you may assign this damage to assets you control that have sanity or health, so allies or cards like Bulletproof Vest or Elder Sign Amulet. When applying damage, remember that all the damage is done simultaneously. So if an ally with 2 health takes 2 damage and 1 horror, they can still have that horror damage applied even though the physical damage is going to defeat it. However, any damage that is left over will go to the investigator. If ever damage done is equal to or in excess of either health or sanity, that investigator or asset is defeated. An enemy that attacks during this phase exhausts but remains engaged with that investigator. Some enemies have the aloof keyword. Aloof enemies will not automatically engage an investigator. To fight or evade it, an investigator must first spend an action to engage it. Massive enemies are considered engaged with each investigator at its location. When it attacks, it will attack each investigator it's engaged with, though attacks of opportunity will only resolve against the investigator that instigated the attack of opportunity. Massive enemies don't follow you when you move, though. They still get to take that attack of opportunity when you move, but they stay where they are. And failing an attack test against a massive enemy does not deal damage to other investigators engaged with it. Enemies with the retaliate keyword will attack you if you fail an attack against them. And similarly, enemies with the alert keyword will attack if you fail an evade attempt. When you've resolved each enemy's attack, move on to the upkeep phase. Ready all exhausted cards, which may cause previously evaded enemies to immediately engage with an investigator. Draw 1 card and take 1 resource. If ever you need to draw a card and no cards remain in your deck, shuffle your discard pile, reset your deck, draw your card, and then take 1 horror. It's a very mean game. Check your hand size. If you have more than 8 cards, you must discard down to 8. However, this is the only time that you have to check this. You can have as many cards in your hand as you want during the Investigator phase, just so long as you drop back down to 8 at the end of the round. If you ever have a weakness that stays in your hand, you may not choose to discard that weakness when you can or must discard a card from your hand. However, if you have to discard a random card from your hand and it happens to be that weakness, no problem there. Although I don't think there are any weaknesses that go into your hand in the core box, but it's still a good rule to know. The mythos phase was skipped in the first round, but happens at the beginning of the round. Place 1 doom on the agenda. Count all doom in play, including doom on locations or on cards like Acolyte, which gets a doom when it enters play. If the doom is equal to or in excess of the doom threshold on the current agenda, you'll advance the agenda. Remove all doom in play, including from that Acolyte. Flip the agenda card over and resolve the back side. However, similar to checking your hand size, checking the doom threshold only happens in this step, so you could be 1 doom away from the agenda advancing and then like 6 acolytes come into play. You're still not going to advance the agenda until the top of the next round. Though some cards, like Ancient Evils, which you'll get to know and hate, will advance the agenda outside of this step because Ancient Evils is a stupid jerk of a card with no friends, and I've heard it has terrible hygiene. That's what I've heard. Check the new agenda for any revelation effects or new rules, and take note of the new doom threshold. Next, in player order, each investigator will draw a card from the encounter deck. Player order always starts with the lead investigator and then moves clockwise to the remaining investigators. It has no actual bearing on what order the investigators took their turns. I like to call this step, make it worse. It's already going pretty bad. Now you gotta make it worse. And remember, you have to do this even on turns where the agenda advanced, so sometimes you're making it a lot worse. Some treacheries have the peril keyword. This means nothing in true solo, but if you're playing with multiple investigators, the investigator that drew that treachery must resolve any tests by themselves, with no outside help from another investigator. If you're playing with other people, it also means that you have to keep that card secret. Other players can't even offer you moral support. If a treachery has the surge keyword, you must draw and resolve another encounter card after you resolve this one. If a card ever gives you a choice, you must choose an option that changes the game state. So if, say, a treachery makes you either add a doom to the agenda or pay 2 resources, but you don't have 2 resources to pay, you must add the doom to the agenda. However, you could choose the option to pay 2 resources if you only had 1 resource, because you're still changing the game state. In this case, you'll just do as much of the option as you can. Defeated enemies with a victory number are placed in a separate victory display rather than the discard pile, even if it says victory 0. This keeps those enemies from coming back into play if ever you have to shuffle the discard pile back into the encounter deck. If ever you must draw a card from the encounter deck but no cards remain, shuffle the encounter discard pile, reset it, and draw that card. Play continues in this way until you reach a resolution or each investigator is defeated. Resolutions are usually found on the back of the act card if you did well, or on the back of the agenda card if you ran out of time. Check the campaign log to see what that resolution is and the next part of the story. When an investigator is defeated, go to the No Resolution Reached section. The investigator will gain mental or physical trauma depending on which type of damage took it out. Trauma is persistent damage that investigator will start each new scenario of the campaign with, but it doesn't change their maximum health or sanity, meaning you could actually heal that damage during a scenario, but you're still going to start the next scenario with that damage. You'll gain experience points based on the number of victory points you have in your victory display, as well as any locations with a victory number that do not have any clues remaining on them. Sometimes you'll also gain bonus experience depending on the resolution you reached or how successful you were. Experience may be spent between scenarios to upgrade your deck. Each of these pips is 1 experience point that you must spend in order to add that card to your deck. Remember that each investigator has a required deck size, so for every card that you add to your deck, you must take a card back out of your deck, with the exception of cards with the permanent keyword. Permanent cards don't count toward your deck size, and they start in play and can never leave play for any reason. If a card is a direct upgrade, you need only spend the difference in experience points. So if you previously spent 3 experience to upgrade to Shriveling level 3, you need only spend 2 more to upgrade it to level 5. You may also swap out a level 0 card for another level 0 card for 1 experience point. Multiple copies of a card are upgraded separately. Some cards, not very many and none in the core box, have the exceptional keyword. These cards will cost double their level in experience to take. So an exceptional card with 2 pips is still considered to be a level 2 card, but it costs 4 XP to add to your deck. You may also spend an experience to add a standalone scenario in between campaign scenarios. Standalones normally have their own chaos bag set up, but if you're playing one mid-campaign, you'll just use the chaos bag you already have. Also, any campaign scenario can be played as a standalone if you just want to play a one-off game or if you're testing out a deck. When playing a standalone scenario, you can play with leveled up cards, but for every 10 experience points that you put into that deck, you must shuffle in one random basic weakness in addition to the one that you're required to take and your own signature weakness. So it's best to try and shoot for 9 or 19 or 29 or whatever experience so you're not taking that next weakness, though this does top out at 49, but that seems insane. You're taking 6 weaknesses in a 37 card deck. When upgrading cards, remember that your Investigator has rules about what kind of leveled up cards they can take. Roland can take levels 0 through 5 Guardian and Neutral cards, but caps out at level 2 for Seeker cards, so no beefed up Cryptic Research. And the deck building rules for all of the core box Investigators are pretty simple. They have one main class that they can take any card of and one off class that they can go up to level 2, but in other expansions, those deck building rules get kind of crazy. Rather than having an off class, some Investigators can just take any other 5 cards from any class. Some can take levels 0 through 5 of a particular trait of a card, like Relic or Allies. You can include up to 2 copies of most cards into your deck, the exceptions being your signature cards and cards with the exceptional keyword, which you can only take 1 of. Also, technically there is a myriad keyword, which means that you can take up to 3 copies of that card, but that's expansion talk. And on the topic of expansions, campaign expansions now come in 2 boxes. One's going to have all the Investigators and player cards, the other's going to have all the scenario cards and all the storyline, though you are still going to need some scenario cards from the core box in order to play those. So if you feel like you're full up on Investigators and you just want to experience more storylines, you can just get the campaigns, but if you really want to dig deep into the deck building possibilities of this game, you can also just get the player cards. There's also the aforementioned standalone scenarios, and there's also standalone Investigators, which come with a already playable pre-built deck. I myself am so bad at the deck building side of this game, so I use ArkhamDB.com to web deck or net deck. I don't remember what the phrase is, but you can use ArkhamDB, Arkham database, ArkhamDB.com to find decks that other people have published. They've already done the math, they've already figured it out, and they've published it for anybody to use. It's awesome. You can also get reviews on cards to see which cards are good with which Investigators. It's just, there's so much on that website. It's such an amazing resource. And that's how to play Arkham Horror the card game. Now get out of my backwater town with a weird smell and super xenophobic undertones. No, really, you should get out. You should leave as soon as you can. It is creepy here. It's creepy here.
The Grouchy Nerd.
No, I'm not trying to kink shame. I don't think that me being sexually attracted to a game because it's mean to me is really the image that I'm trying to put out on the internet, you know? Hey, you turned that off, right?